Oh, here you
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
This amendment, which is 11.
Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations outside. Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, this amendment is a 11 McCain-Feinstein-Udall amendment. It clarifies that Gitmo detainees would not gain any additional legal rights as a result of their transfer to the United States for detention.
Order. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations to the hallway.
So thank you, Madam President. Any Gitmo detainee who is transferred to the United States gains no additional legal rights. They also are not permitted to be released inside the United States. They don't lose their status as unprivileged enemy belligerents eligible for detention and trial under the law of war. If they are transferred to the United States, they gain no additional right to challenge their detention beyond the habeas corpus that has been affirmed by the Supreme Court. I would hope this could be broadly supported. Senator McCain.
Madam President,
Senate will be in order.
I have a letter from
Senator from Arizona.
I have a letter from 38 retired flag and general officers of the United States military, and I quote, "As retired flag and general officers, we believe it's imperative for Congress to address Guantanamo now. We have always believed that our detention policies should adhere to the rule of law, and we as a nation are more secure when we do. Guantanamo is a betrayal of American values. The prison is a symbol of torture and justice delayed. More than a decade after it opened, Guantanamo remains a recruiting poster for terrorists, which makes us all less safe. I would also point out to my colleagues, Guantanamo has cost more than $400 million in the last 2 fiscal years, and the Department of Defense estimates that there's $2.7 million per detainee per year." And, Madam President, I ask that the letter be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I would urge my colleagues to vote against Amendment 2175. If you want to bring the 164 Gitmo detainees to the United States, that's what this amendment will allow the administration to do. And the plan that they're going to submit requires no congressional oversight, no approval, and does not answer the question. The chairman said that they will not get any additional legal rights. What about constitutional rights if they are brought to our soil? Will they have to be told they have the right to remain silent? If we catch Zawahiri, the current head of al-Qaeda, tomorrow, will he have to be read Miranda rights? Because that is what's happening when we bring them to U.S. soil now. And that is the real question here, and that is not required to be answered by their plan that the administration must sense, and we have no oversight over that plan, Madam President. I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Senator from Michigan.
15 seconds. I'd ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
There are no additional rights for people brought to military detention in the United States than they have in Guantanamo. Nothing changes. There's no more Miranda rights here than there are in Guantanamo. If they're in military detention, they're in military detention wherever it is.
All time has expired. Under the previous order, the question occurs on the Levin McCain Amendment 2175. Somebody's going to ask.
Is there a sufficient second?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
Regardless of whether they say it has worked, regardless of whether they say it.
Give you a
Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. I got you. Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller,
Duff, no.
Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin,
Thank you, Daddy.
No.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. King, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Leahy, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Hortman, Pryor, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sanders, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Warren, Wicker. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 46. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I'm going to announce a consent agreement. I'll read through it in just a minute. But it seems to me this debate we had today was extremely important. As I said last night, one of the issues in this bill is Guantanamo. And I felt it was appropriate, even though I agree with the language that's in the bill, that the Republicans have an opportunity to see if they could change it. That's what this is all about this afternoon. On the sexual assault issue, there's language in the bill. Senator Gillibrand and others want to change that. Senator Levin and especially Senator McCaskill have come up with a side-by-side, just like we had here. That deserves a full debate. It's an issue that's been in all the papers, all the news stories for the last several months. The Senate deserves this, and the American public deserves this debate. So I would hope we could get this done. So I ask unanimous consent that the pending 11 Amendment number 2123 be set aside for Senator Gillibrand or designate to offer an Amendment 2099 relative to sexual assault. That the amendment be subject to a relevant side-by-side amendment from Senators McCaskill and Ayotte, Amendment number 2170. That no secondary amendments be in order to either of the sexual assault amendments. That each of these amendments be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold. That when the Senate resumes consideration of the bill on Wednesday, November 20th, the time until 5 p.m. be equally divided between the proponents and opponents of the Gillibrand amendments, divided between the proponents and the opponents of the Gillibrand amendment, and at 5 p.m. the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the Gillibrand amendment, number 2099, that upon disposition of the Gillibrand amendment, the Senate vote in relation to the McCaskill-Ayotte amendment 2170, that there be 2 minutes equally divided between the votes, and no motion is to recommit be in order during the consideration of the sexual assault amendments.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. Would the Senator amend his request to add the following language? The following disposition of the McCaskill-Ayotte amendment, all pending amendments be withdrawn, and that the Republican manager or his designee be recognized to offer the next amendment in order, followed by an amendment offered by the majority side, and that the two sides continue offering amendments in alternating fashion until all amendments are disposed of.
Will the Leader so modify his request?
Madam President, with the deepest respect to my friend, the senior senator from Oklahoma, we are not in a position to have a bunch of amendments on this bill. It took us weeks to get compounding done, weeks, plural. What we should do is get this very contentious amendment out of the way and move on to other amendments. There's no reason that we can't agree amendment to amendment. We are not. Everyone has to understand. Everyone has to understand. This is not going to be an open amendment process. Not going to happen. We tried that. Remember? People said, we haven't done anything on energy for 5 years. That pretty well says it all. But we said, okay, what we want to do is work on something that was bipartisan in nature, led by Senator Shaheen. Senator Portman was heavily involved in that. We never got off first base. We never even got headed toward first base. So we can't do that. There's going to have to be a change of atmosphere around here where we agree to do legislation. We talk about, I remember the good old days when we had unlimited amendments. I remember those too. But I also remember the good old days where the majority would have a few amendments, the minority would have a like number of amendments, and we'd move forward and pass legislation. But no one's willing to do that now. We are, but they're not. So I know how well-intentioned my friend is, but that was then, and this is now. I object. I don't accept his modification of my request.
Is there objection to the original request?
Object.
Objection is heard.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I have a motion to recommit S. 1197 with instructions at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, moves to recommit the bill to the Committee on Armed Services with instructions to report back with an amendment number 2305.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that motion.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have an amendment to the instructions at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment number 2306 to the instructions of the motion to recommit.
I ask for the yeas and nays on this amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have a secondary amendment at the desk that I totally forgot about.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment number 2307 to amendment number 2306.
Madam President, what I would hope we could do tomorrow, as we did today, I would hope people that feel strongly about this sexual assault issue would come and talk about it. It's so important. We were able to do that today on this amendment that we had, and by the time 5 o'clock came, there had been a full discussion of this amendment. No one was crying for more time. So I would hope in the morning people who feel strongly about this issue would come and talk. We did have some people that came and talked today on the issue, and that was important. We did that. So there are very strong feelings about this amendment. It's a difficult issue. It's sexual assault in the military. Madam President, it wasn't long ago we wouldn't even be discussing such a thing on the Senate floor. We have to now, because it's an issue that the military has, and we are trying to work through this. People have different views on how to proceed, but everyone agrees that things need to change. It's a question of how we change it. That's what this debate is all about. So I would hope that senators would come in the morning and start talking about this issue. Tee it up for a vote sometime tomorrow afternoon. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that we now proceed to a period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each, and we could do that until 7:30 tonight. And we would only, and during that period of time, it would be for debate only.
Is there objection? Without objection. Oh, there you are. Senator from Iowa.
Oh.
I couldn't locate it.
I'd like to address another round of attacks that have been spearheaded by big oil against America's biofuel producers. As the market share for big oil dips, big oil is doubling down to swat down its perennial piñata. This time around, petroleum producers and food conglomerates are using environmental groups as political cover to gain traction on efforts to pull the plug on the renewable fuel standard that we often refer to as RFS. This is ridiculously transparent and very much self-serving assault by these special interest groups. The relentless campaign to discredit ethanol undermines America's long-standing efforts to diversify energy landscape, fuel the economy, and most importantly, strengthening our national security. The predictable efforts to smear ethanol's reputation, ignore the renewable fuel's valuable contribution to clean energy, rural development, job creation, and U.S. energy independence. The latest round of misguided untruths disregard the plain truth. The plain truth is ethanol is renewable, it's sustainable, it's a clean-burning fuel, and all this helps run the nation's transportation fleet with less pollution and less imported oil. And let me remind you, most of that imported oil comes from countries that hate us and use our money to potentially kill Americans. Yet critics continue to hide behind distortions that claim ethanol is bad for the environment. And those distortions I want to discuss. I'd like to separate fact from fiction regarding ethanol's impact on the environment. Critics say farmers are putting fragile land into production to cash in on higher corn prices at the expense of soil erosion and clean water. Now, that argument's not good under any respects. It may have been better last year and the year before when corn was $7, but corn's about $4 a bushel now, hardly making ends meet. They point out that 5 million Conservation Reserve Program, those are CPR acres, are no longer enrolled in the conservation program since 2008. They want to pin the blame on ethanol. But the facts are, first of all, fewer acres enrolled in CRP has more to do with federal belt tightening, meaning spending less money here in Congress, than land stewardship's decisions made by corn farmers. The 2008 Farm Bill had a lot to do with it. That Farm Bill built upon other stewardship incentives for American farmers and ranchers administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including the environmental quality investment programs, wetland restoration, and wildlife habitat programs. So land put into these programs under the 2008 Farm Bill takes land out of crop production, but it's not the ethanol industry that's done it, it's federal policy. For instance, the Wetlands Reserve Program in 2012 had a record-breaking enrollment of 2.65 million acres. The Wetlands Reserve Program lands cannot be farmed for 30 years. So they aren't going to be raising corn on that land to produce ethanol. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, no new grassland has been converted to cropland since 2005. Farmers must make marketing, planning, and stewardship decisions that keep their operation financially sound and productive from crop year to crop year. Even more importantly, these decisions must be environmentally sustainable for the long haul, both from the standpoint of the farmer's economic well-being as well as meeting certain laws that require that. So let me be clear. Farmers simply can't afford to not take scrupulous care of the land that sustains their livelihoods. Fertilizer use is on the decline. Compare application per bushel in 1980 versus 2010. Nitrogen is down 43%, phosphate is down 58%, and potash is down 64%. Ethanol burns cleaner than gasoline. According to the Argonne National Laboratory, corn ethanol reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 34% compared to gasoline. If the oil industry wants to talk about the environment, we should not forget, and I will remind them, and the people behind this move, about the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill, or the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spills in the Mexican Gulf. Critics also say that the renewable fuel standard is driving more acres into corn production. Well, the fact is, if facts mean anything, The IRF is driving significant investment in higher yielding, drought-resistant seed technology that very much enhances production per acre. This is a win-win scenario to cultivate good-paying jobs, mostly in rural America, and to harvest better yields on less land. The total cropland planted to corn in the United States is decreasing. Let's compare this year's crop year, when U.S. farmers planted 97 million acres of corn, 97 million corn acres. In the 1930s, farmers planted 103 million acres of corn. Farmers have increased corn harvest through higher yields, not more acres. Critics contend that the nation's corn crop is diverted for fuel use at the expense of feed for livestock and higher prices at the grocery store. But what are the facts? In reality, 1/3 of the corn processed to make ethanol re-enters the marketplace as high-valued animal feed called dried distiller's grain. Livestock feed remains the largest end user of corn. So I get so darn tired of hearing people from big oil or these environmental groups or these big supermarket conglomerates say that 40% of the corn produced goes into ethanol when they don't give credit for the 18 pounds of every 56-pound bushel of corn. 18 pounds, or 1/3 of it, is used for animal feed. So when co-products such as the dried distiller's grain are factored in, then ethanol consumes only about 27% of the whole corn grain by volume. Livestock feed uses 50%. Critics have also pursued the false accusation that the increased production of biofuels increases grocery prices. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. The facts are that the U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary has said farmers receive about 14 cents of every food dollar spent in the grocery stores, and the farmer's share of a $4 box of cornflakes is only 10 cents. So what's at stake when a coalition of special interests tag teams to pull the rug out from underneath the nation's ethanol policy? Well, there's a lot at stake. Unfortunately, these flawed attacks on ethanol and next-generation biofuels undermine America's effort to move forward with an aggressive, diversified energy policy that takes into account global demand, geopolitics, and U.S. economic growth. Now it has resulted in an EPA that has wholeheartedly adopted this false narrative promoted by big oil and big oil allies. On Friday, then, the EPA released its proposed rule for the required volumes under the renewable fuel standard for next year. The EPA in this proposal chose to reduce the overall biofuel mandate. Rather than increase the amount of biofuel to be blended as the law requires, the EPA has chosen to waive the mandate and suggest that we use less homegrown renewable biofuel in our fuel supply, hence more dependence upon foreign sources of energy. It's terribly disappointing that the U.S. biofuels industry is now under attack from President Obama's EPA. This action, which was vigorously pursued by big oil, is a slap in the face of our domestic energy producers. Who would have believed that big oil found an ally in President Obama's EPA, since he's been such a defender of biofuels and all green energy? Who would have expected the Obama EPA to be more harmful to our domestic biofuels effort than President Bush ever was? You know, President Bush was demagogued as an oil man from Texas. But he never undermined biofuels to the extent that this proposal from this EPA would. In making this announcement, the EPA said that the challenges to supplying more ethanol to the market are too great of the so-called, is too great because of the so-called blend wall. The fact is, the blend wall is a creation of big oil. The primary reason ethanol is not blended at levels higher than 10% today is because big oil has stood in the way. Congress knew in 2007 that the RF, Renewable Fuel Standard, would require biofuels to be blended at levels higher than 10%. But the petroleum companies fought that every step of the way, going back 4 or 5 years, and finally, last Friday, they were successful. And Friday's announcement, by the way, by EPA rewarded them for their temper tantrums. The EPA's proposal puts big oil in charge of how we implement the renewable fuel standard. It has rewarded big oil for its intransigence. While EPA says its intention is to put the RFS program on a manageable trajectory that will support continued growth, I want to tell you the exact opposite is true. This proposal is a step back, not a step forward. It undercuts all segments of biofuel, including biodiesel, ethanol, and the advanced biofuels that go by the name of cellulosic ethanol. While this administration claims to have an energy strategy of all of the above, this decision by EPA proves it's in favor of none of the above. Ironically, biofuel producers now know what it's like for traditional energy producers with a bureaucracy that impedes domestic energy production at every turn. I find this decision baffling. I hope President Obama will see the harmful impacts of the EPA proposal and fix this mistake during the 60-day period that EPA must take to consider opinions on this issue. So there's 60 days to turn this around. I hope that we can do that. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.